Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, my name is Richard Cullen, and for the last 15 years, my passion in scuba diving has been adaptive teaching, working with people who've had life-changing mental and/or physical challenges. And for 10 of those years, on a voluntary basis, I was very proud to lead UK charity Depth Therapy, working with armed forces who'd been injured in the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. But being retired from normal work allowed me during those 15 years to actually research the theory and practice of adaptive teaching. And I think even more importantly, it allowed me to understand the medical issues around diving with disabilities, both physical and mental, and the impacts of medication which people just don't realize. And I've entitled the presentation, Exploding the Myths, because that's what it is. We built up myths around adaptive teaching. Those myths have been created by the diver training agencies, some for the purposes of marketing, and they've been created by some instructors who have egos that are absolutely unbelievable. And we know best, and nobody else can contribute to this. And I think somebody mentioned earlier, Gareth Locke's work about psychological safety. Somebody comes to you with a major physical or mental illness or injury. They are vulnerable, they are exposed, and you actually give them all this ego and tell them how the world's going to be. They actually become quite scared of what's happening. This video that I'm going to show is very short. It's of a guy called Josh. He lost both his legs above his knee and one arm below the elbow, and he's on his rescue course in Egypt. So you won't see many better rescue lifts from people who've got all their limbs. And this video's been used by many, many agencies to try and market adaptive teaching. But we've got one big problem with adaptive teaching, and that is how we've all learnt to dive. We were actually taught to dive in a very formulaic manner. It's a drill. This is how you remove, replace, and clear a mask. This is how you do a giant stride entry. And that carries on through our development as divers. And it carries on to when we become dive masters and we start to learn how to demonstrate those skills. And when we become instructors, we're taught on our instructors development course to do exactly the same. And we're assessed in that same formulaic nature. And unfortunately for some instructors, they have a tunnel vision. They can't see past that. But in adaptive teaching, you can't have a tunnel vision. It has to be based on the individual. If you look at this slide, the guy at the back has a through-the-shoulder injury. It's a very, very unusual amputation, and he's got a prosthetic shoulder, a sponge shoulder, so he can actually wear clothes. You can't say to him, this is how I remove, replace, and clear a mask with my two hands. He's got one hand. He's got no stump to hold it on. So he needs to work out this way. And I watched an instructor try and teach him. The instructor tried to put a mask on single-handed, bolted to the surface, swallowed water, and had to get out of the pool. This guy can do a necktie up with his one hand. He can do his shoelaces up with one hand. So never make assumptions about what your student can actually do. The guy at the front here is Chris, and he appears in several other photographs. He's lost both his legs. When he became a dive master, we put it on Facebook. A PADI instructor put on Facebook, "This is disgraceful, you've breached standards." And I said, "How have we breached standards?" He said he can't do a giant stride. I said, "Where's a giant stride, a standard with PADI?" "Oh yes, confined water dive 2, you have to do a deep water entry unassisted." "Where does it say giant stride?" "No, you're wrong, you failed, you've cheated, you've done it because he's disabled." And actually, I've got to give Paddy credit for once. They actually did take the instructor on and say he needed some remedial training. But what my views, and these are my views, they're not any agency's views, they're the team that I worked with at therapy. You have to base adaptive teaching on the individual. Each person is unique. How you work with them is unique. No case of post-traumatic stress disorder is the same. No person, even with exactly the same amputation, will be the same in the water. So you need to treat them individually. And what you do has to be bespoke. It can't be formulaic. You have to work with the student. And again, this is where human divers stuff is so important. It's about what I call, Gareth will tell me off, I call them soft skills. He says they're non-technical skills. But it's about the leadership. It's about the communication. It's about saying to the person, "This is how I would do it. How would you do it?" And if they say, "I need some help with that," then you can start giving them some ideas. So I learnt to become an adaptive instructor with Disabled Divers International, which no longer exists. My 2-day course was abysmal. Spent lots of time listening to the instructor's ego about himself, spent a lot of time in the pub, and didn't actually learn very much about adaptive teaching. But he knew best because he was in a wheelchair and actually nobody else could contribute to it. I decided I wanted to move forward. I went on the program to become a staff instructor, and eventually I qualified as an instructor trainer with DDI. And I've got to say it was an abysmal experience. And I decided things needed to change. And when we formed Depth Therapy, I said with the team that we need to set our own pros course. We need to find something very special. And this was before even I'd seen Gareth's work about human factors. But I knew that was important. It wasn't just the technical skills. It was about actually bringing in these soft skills. And Frank Buchanan runs a scuba trust. Those of you in the UK will know it. It's a well-restricted disabled diving charity. Frank's been around the world with various courses. He's learned with various agencies. But he said nobody offered what we'd got. And that's where I want to be with this. I don't anticipate at the end of this presentation that PADI, SSI and RAID and everybody are going to change what they do. But actually the world does need to change. Now, those of you who have been lucky enough to dive in Truck Lagoon will know that once you get on a dive boat and you head out towards the wreck and you look at the island, it's just like that first shot in Jurassic Park when the helicopter's going onto the island before you meet the dinosaurs. To me, this slide means a lot. One, that's Josh. Two, it's in Truck. But it sums up why depth therapy is very different than this concept of let's take somebody diving and we'll rehabilitate them. This was the end of a 3-year cycle. Team of 18 guys had learnt with us to dive as open water divers. We'd taken them through advanced open water, rec, deep. They'd done a week's course in marine biology, and we were going to do a survey on the Shinkoko Maru in Truck Lagoon and actually hand that survey, the first ever done of a rec, to the Micronesian government. But what it also reminds me of is where adaptive teaching is. Adaptive teaching, in my view, is in Jurassic Park. It is outdated. The pioneers in 1982 were brilliant. I absolutely got admiration for them. But things haven't moved forward. People took what the Handicapped Scuba Association wrote, and they've actually just added them to new manuals as it's gone on. So there's pages and pages and pages about spinal injury. There's about this much about amputations. You're far, far more likely to find somebody who's had an amputation than you are somebody who's had spinal injuries. And you're far, far, far more likely to meet somebody who's got a mental health issue or is on the neurodivergent paradigm. And in one manual, its comment about people with leg amputations is if they wear prosthetics, they're likely to be unstable. I think we should tell the guy who climbed to the top of Everest, who'd had both his legs amputated above the knee on prosthetics earlier this year, that he's actually unstable on his feet. And that's where we are. And mental health, one manual says they need clearance from a doctor. Nothing else mentioned in the manual about it. So here's the big misconception. Scuba diving is for everyone. This is a British Sub-Aqua Club. Diving like any other club member. PADI's got exactly the same. Accessible diving for everyone. Just like any other club member. Trouble is, it's misleading because it's not true. In each of the manuals, PADI, SSI, BZAC, anywhere you want to look, you will find a sentence or a paragraph that actually says not everyone can dive. There are medical conditions that are contraindicated to diving, and there are medications that are contraindicated to diving. But there's lots more untruths here. There is no Lazarus moment. It's like a certain agency showed a picture of a guy who they said had been in a wheelchair for 12 years, hadn't been able to walk. He went on a tri-dive, and the next day he started to walk again. Actually, physically impossible. The benefits are overstated. People are actually saying it's a panacea for mental health. Take somebody diving, they'll recover from mental health. Research. Depth Therapies commission more research into adaptive teaching than any other agency, is misquoted. What's very often said is depth therapy research shows that scuba diving saves somebody's life. Actually, what was said was depth therapy saved my life. But depth therapy is far more. It's about a program, it's about mental health training, it's about working with families, and it's a 3-year cycle. It's not taking somebody on an open water dive and saying, you're suddenly healed. So agencies have chosen to do that for marketing. This is a good friend of mine, Dimitri. He's an adaptive instructor in Russia and Egypt. And really, he's quite straightforward when you manage to get him to speak in English. And this really sums it up. Somebody put an article in one of the dive magazines about scuba diving being the panacea for mental health. And he summed it up. They're either a liar or delusional. And that's the reality. It can help. It does help. But you actually need a knowledgeable, supportive community there to help a person over a period of time. This one I'm going to leave. This, unfortunately, sums up adaptive teaching. The egos are massive. It's like there's been a discussion on Facebook recently about adaptive teaching, where I was actually saying it needs to change. And somebody wrote from the HSA, we are the world's leading authority on adaptive teaching. I haven't had a reply to the question, who's told you so? But that's what people do, and they all argue with each other. The International Association of Handicapped Divers are falling out with the Handicapped Scuba Association about who thinks they're the best in the world. This is quite important. I was asked by PADI when they launched their manual to go down to the PADI EMEA headquarters in Bristol and teach the directors down there about adaptive teaching. And for the second 2 days, I helped their head of training run a course for course directors. I went around the course directors and I said, can you tell me who's worked with a disabled person? One of the course directors said, I've never done it before. They came on the course. 2 weeks later, they were advertising adaptive instructor training courses when they'd never worked with a disabled person and described themselves as having expertise in the area. Most people go shock and horror, this doesn't exist. Stigmatization is actually massive in the industry. A study in the UK by the Diving.Throughout Research Centre, anonymous and random, showed a substantial number of people who were divers had diagnosed mental health problems but did not declare them on their medical form because fear of they wouldn't be allowed to dive. And if you extrapolate the figures, there's thousands of people, some with serious mental health issues, diving who've never declared those conditions. The other side of it is, the worst thing you can do is show us pity. This is another one of these unstable amputees who's actually a Paralympic snowboarder. But he said that to an instructor trainer who started putting his kit together on a dive boat in Florida. And he said, why are you doing it? He said, well, just to help you. He said, well, you're not helping that person who's actually got both their legs. Why are you doing it for me? And unfortunately, what happens is very often the emotional takes over the rational. And we've got evidence of multiple cases where people have been qualified as divers when they haven't met the standards because somebody's done somebody a favour out of pity. And we've had to retrain people who've been certified as open water divers. They've appeared on a depth therapy course and they've not had the training, they've not done the skills. One had never ever done a deep water entry on their own. One had never had to remove and replace a mask because the instructor said, you've got a bad enough problem having a broken back, so I don't want you getting stressed about removing a mask. Mark Powell last year talked about good enough is not good enough. And this is a real truism because with adaptive teaching, you're actually talking about people with life-changing injuries getting in the water and diving with a buddy. And if they're not up to standard, you're putting somebody in the water with another diver who's a liability. So you have to really make sure they can't just do the skills, but they're a really good diver in the water for their own safety and for their buddy's safety. This is Chris, and one of the things he said, I don't want a cert card that says Handicapped Scuba Association, Disabled Divers International. I actually want to be a diver. I want a PADI, I want a RAID certificate. He's a phenomenal swimmer, he's phenomenally fit, can do it easily. But you'll probably be surprised, there's no ISO or WRSTC standards for adaptive teaching. Everybody writes their own manual, everybody decides what they think the criteria are. And when you get, and this isn't PADI, because PADI you have to be able to meet all the PADI standards, but DDI, SSI, HSI, IAHD have restricted certifications for people who actually cannot meet all the standards and require different levels of support in the water. But the differences are unbelievable. So if somebody came to me as a RAID instructor and said they were qualified with SSI, I wouldn't know what skills they'd done. There's no agreed naming conventions. There's no agreed tactile signals for people without sight. RAID have them. We have classified divers with SSI. We have level A, level B divers with other organisations. It's just unbelievable. And finally, for those who are going to be adaptive trained buddies, one agency says you can be open water with 20 dives. One says you have to be a rescue diver. One actually says you have to be advanced open water. So we can't actually even agree those standards. It is a mess. If there's a message I can get to anybody out here, it's to actually see if we can make a wee bit of change about it, and for you as individuals to take a different view. But thank you for your attention, and let's talk about diving. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.